So again, thank you for staying. On behalf of West Beacon Prairie, I'd like to again thank Sheriff John Spears, I almost did call you pastor here now, for being at both services to talk about this presentation and to share that this is a problem that we need to be aware of. And to my left here is Sister Marlene Weisenbeck. She is from the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration out of La Crosse and leads the La Crosse Task Force on eradicating human trafficking. And so I appreciate her coming to spend the morning with us. Thank you, Sister.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you very much for this opportunity to spend some time with you thinking about a problem in our world which is very disturbing. And Franciscans like to say, part of our call is to be a disturbing presence in the world. And so when we talk about this topic of human trafficking, if I disturb you just a little bit today, or if you leave more sober about the topic, I'll feel like I was successful. You maybe wonder how I ever got into the topic of human trafficking. Just very briefly, let me say that I was asked to serve on President Obama's Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships Advisory Council from 2012 to 2013. And when we arrived at the White House, we were asked if we would study the topic of modern slavery and report to the president. So for a year and a half, that was the length of our appointment, that's what we did. We were leaders of major religious organizations as well as nonprofit organizations in the United States, and quite frankly, most of us knew very, very little about it. Part of our service on the advisory council was to receive training and in service so that we could go home and feel a little more competent to speak about it. And I want to thank Sheriff Spears to be being here with me today, because the relationship with law enforcement is so critical in this issue of human trafficking today. You'll notice that the title of my presentation is Merchandising in Human Flesh. Those are words used by Pope Francis in his Easter message of 2013. He has been one of the world leaders in working against human trafficking, and he has such a unique way of being able to say things just like they are. Merchandising in human flesh is what it's all about. So let's take a look on a global basis of what's going on. We don't have to study this map real quickly because the colors tell us real clearly where the most amount of human trafficking that is taking place in the world. The darker colors are the places of more intense exploitation around the world. And we know that about 5 countries are more prominent in these areas. Uzbekistan, Bangladesh, China, India, and I think I've named them all, Pakistan, are the areas of greatest concentration. But a thing to remember also is that there are over 500 traffic flows around the world, and these flow literally around the world. About 25% of the human trafficking that takes place in the United States comes from international sources. So, we can't say it's everybody else's fault. It happens right here. And I like to we must begin really with a definition of human trafficking so that we know what the critical elements of the definition are. It's about recruiting, obtaining, providing, transporting persons for compelled labor or commercial sex acts through the use of force, fraud, and coercion. The 3 words to really remember here are force, fraud, and coercion. This definition comes from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, a federal piece of legislation. So our government has been working at this for a while. It's not new. And that piece of legislation also describes it as involuntary servitude, slavery, debt bondage, or forced labor. And I always like to say here that human trafficking, modern slavery, isn't just naughty behavior. It is a human rights crime. Let's just take another look at the definition, broken apart a little differently. It's called the AMP model. And these are the elements, and I am repeating them again, that meet the trafficking definition. First, the action. What's required under the action? Inducing, recruit, harbor, transport, provide, or obtain. And what are the means? Force, fraud, and coercion, and the purpose of it, commercial sex or labor services. We need to remember, though, that in this definition, that if minors are induced into commercial sex, they are already trafficked victims. They do not have to meet the criteria of force, fraud, or coercion. A minor person is already considered forced in a fraudulent situation to have sex with someone who has control over them. And that word control, I think if I had to put a word over human trafficking, I would say control. Anyone can be victimized, financially or physically or emotionally, by someone else for the purpose of control, controlling them. The person loses their personal freedom to escape, to say no, to try to get away. They truly are in another person's control. And it makes them feel very, very powerless to change their circumstances. In fact, research is telling us that it takes 7 to 10 times for a person who has been trafficked to get themselves out of the life. Sometimes it's like a sense of addiction, but it's also the fact that they are so controlled and threatened that they just can't get out of it by saying one time, I'm going to get out of it. There's always someone standing over their shoulder, behind them, before them, beside them, controlling their situation. And a person's basic needs are exploited. That's how it starts. And I'd like to just say a few things about human trafficking and how it begins. What you see on the screen there are the words of a pimp himself. He said a lot of times it's just trick and coercion. These guys know how to find vulnerable individuals, for as John indicated before Mass, they come out of broken homes. They might have run away from their home. They have some problem related perhaps to addiction or physical abuse in the home. And so they're out there, and that's where the pimps start. They gain their trust. Sometimes they get them hooked on drugs. And to give a person drugs means already that you're putting them in a position where they're not in control of their own faculties of thinking and moving in the way that they would like to. And so once you're under the control of drugs that might have been forced on you, there's a lot of ways to force drugs on people, then they can't get away. If they've been taken from their home miles away, they just can't call home at night to mom or to dad. In fact, maybe the first thing that happens is that the pimp will take away any of their identity documents if they have them. They'll take away their cell phones, and they have access to nothing. This slide goes into Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's how the pimp works. And he says, or she, and it can be a woman, my job is to make sure she has what she needs. personal hygiene, getting her nails done, buying her a new outfit so that she feels good and looks pretty. But whatever she earns for me is my money. It's not her money. So it starts with basic physiological needs on the bottom of that pyramid. Food and shelter. If they're hungry, give them something to eat. Clothing, making them feel good. Saying to them that I'll take care of you. You'll be safe with me. You don't have to worry about anybody else. And in this process, I love you. And of course, you love me. The conviction that is happening there. All of these things begin to grow on a person's self-esteem. Oh, I'm respected. I'm loved. I mean something to someone. And then soon that takes away a person's ability to become who they really are. There's not a sense of mutuality in the human relationship. And as one pimp says, you promise them heaven and they'll go to hell with you. Sheriff Spears has already said to you that human trafficking can take place in many different ways. It can be forced or bonded labor. It can be sex trafficking. It can be domestic labor, involuntary domestic labor. Could be migrant workers who are paying debt bondage to their owners, selling body organs. We're hearing more and more about this in the news, that people actually sell their body organs, a kidney, for example, or something, an eye part, or whatever, so that someone can sell it to a fraudulent medical organization and make money. Child pornography or soldiering, begging and peddling by children, illegal adoptions, and mail-order brides. I know a survivor that lives not too far from here who was forced into a child marriage at the age of 8. Is it legal in our country? Of course not. But the relationship was explained to her as a marriage. And she lived through that for a whole long time. Today, what we know, there's about 45.8 million slaves in the world, fitting into all of these categories. And researchers will always say, this is what we know. There could be more. One in 4 of these victims are children. And the number of children depends on the part of the world where it's happening. Asia and the Middle East do have the most number of children who are trafficked. Southeast Asia and the Pacific second. The United States and South America, about 27% of the children are in bondage. Europe and Central Asia have the best record. I say the best record because I'm going to talk about legislation just a little bit. And, I say we hear around this region of our country about homeless children. And I don't know if you have any homeless children in Westby, but we do in La Crosse. And we try to count them. Sometimes I hear the number 150 to 200 homeless children. Okay, do your arithmetic. Within 3 hours of a child on the street, they're likely to be picked up, 1 in 4. So how many kids might be trafficked in some way or other right here in our own locality? It's scary. As John said, slave traders make more than $32 billion. That's just on sex trading. Overall, sex and labor, it's $150 billion a year profits. And I like this slide because it says that's more than Nike, Google, and Starbucks profits together. We take some of our favorite industries, coffee and shoes and what we're doing on the internet all the time with Google and what they provide with us. Take all their profits together, and slave trade is bigger than that. Here's a few more known facts. About 63% of the slaves are sexually exploited, and about 1/3, or 15 million, are in forced labor industries that could be in a variety of industries. I'm going to come back to what are the main industries in a bit. This slide shows from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center that in 5 years, the number of human trafficking cases that have been reported, not all of them are reported, have tripled. About a 25% increase in the past 5 years. I always give a little caveat here to say that might be good or it might be bad. It makes us feel like the problem is getting worse, but actually it might be that we're getting better at reporting the issue. So we don't really know. We can only say what we know. And we know that more and more reports are being made. Experts will say that's probably because of the consciousness that's being raised in our communities. If trafficked victims become aware and hear others talking about the problem, they know someone out there is talking about the problem, and that maybe there's help for them because of that. And they might not, feel so shamed and so helpless to get help if they know someone is talking about it. So it could be a good thing. The top 3 sex trafficking types in 2016 came from escort services like Backpage or Craigslist, and illicit massage businesses. One survivor said to me a couple of weeks ago, "Look around your town. Do you have any establishments like that?" And she said, if you do, you can likely expect trouble in the area of sex trafficking and in residential situations. I'll be coming back to the residential because the majority of human trafficking begins in the family or interfamilial situations. A survivor from Green Bay, or was it Alpatlan, reported on Wisconsin Teen TV. My grandmother did it, my mother did it, and they taught me how to do it, or how to become a victim. She was dragged off to Atlanta for a number of years and took a long, long time before she was able to leave the life. She gave testimony at the Capitol in Madison when some legislation was pending. She could not talk. Someone needed to stand next to her for a sense of security, but she was there. The top 3 labor trafficking types are domestic work, agriculture, and traveling sales crews. I don't think that we should be too surprised about that. There's a lot of hired, forced, bonded labor in agriculture and domestic work. And the top 5 locations that have been referenced in overseas cases are Mexico, Canada, Philippines, United Kingdom, and United Arab Emirates. As we go on to talk about this issue, I like us to remember that we can consider human trafficking in 3 dimensions: supply, distribution, and demand. They all work together. That's why I have those circles interconnected with one another. And here's how it works. Take a look at that funnel and just think, okay, that's a picture of society, or our world, or our town, or our locality. And in an underground economy that is working, there are all kinds of people that promote the issues of human trafficking and make it happen. All the way from people who are watching and looking around and making connections in the whole trafficking business. Recruiters, sometimes they're called. There are people who groom the people that are recruited bottom and then sold off to a bottom, and the trafficker in the end who gets most of the money. It is said today that the average age of buying or the average amount to buy a slave today is $90. So if we say that's average, we know that many times it's much, much more than that. Here's a picture of basically the same thing. This graphic came from a piece of research that came out of Minneapolis and St. Paul a couple of years ago, trying to explain how the market works. And I think it's interesting, in various parts of research, they always use this funnel, and the funnel goes out and looks for all of those vulnerable populations, pregnant teens, it could be a runaway child, it could be people with competitive delays, people who are involved with drug abuse. Get myself wired again. Okay. And, when researchers look at this, they'll say, well, what's the matter in our society that this is happening? So they'll say, well, there's gender bias, there is poverty, there's racism, there's corruption on many, many levels. But what the victims will say? It doesn't happen unless there's demand. You can put all of those other structural inequalities around it, but if somebody doesn't want it, it wouldn't happen. And when you interview a victim, very often, and you say, well, what made the difference for you to get into it? And they'll say, someone asked. It was a person. It was someone demanding it from me. So we've already mentioned the at-risk populations and the issue of interfamilial histories that keep this operation of human trafficking going on in our communities and around the world. And of course, there's a lot of different outlets. Besides those escorts, there are brothels, street-based groups, closed buyers, sex groups, networks, peers. Have you ever heard of a college student being connected into human trafficking by a roommate at college? It happens, sometimes unknowingly and sometimes deliberately. Where are they recruited? Well, as we've already mentioned, most of them, about 2/3 of them, are recruited and tricked into it by others. That's why the issue of fraud, I think, comes so prominently into human trafficking. But more than 1/3 are brought into it by families and friends. That is such a scary thing, because we begin to wonder, who can I trust? What does a young person say when they're looking for friends and trying to establish relationships? Who can I trust and what can I do? But there are lots of other places where it can happen too. It can happen at a courthouse, it can happen in a mall, in a corner store, and in schools. And I've talked to a number of educators in La Crosse district, at least. I give this presentation and I look them in the eye and I say, have you ever seen a trafficked child in your school? And they go, yes, you described it perfectly. Our problem is we're not getting good enough yet at reporting it. This slide, to me, is really scary. Who does this? Who are the ones making the demand? Who are buying the slaves? 40.5% are people who work in positions of trust. It could be parents, it could be teachers, coaches, faith leaders, law enforcement, people in positions of trust. And it was interesting that a survivor recently said to me from Minneapolis, "Oh, down there on Hennepin Street, that's where it happens, but you know where the people live? They live on the outskirts of the city and in more affluent areas. They come there to do their buying." 50% involve children younger than 14. Usually they say between 12 and 14. And this is why I'm placing so much emphasis on children, because of the number of them when this begins. It begins in their early adolescent years. And finally, this statistic about 70% of buyers who are found guilty receive a sentence suspension. Why is it suspended? On an average of 85% of the time. We're learning that some of the people who are most responsible in our society for this are still learning what the law is. When I first started this work in La Crosse in 2013, the first person I went to were a couple of judges. And they said, "We never had a case. It doesn't happen here. They're not coming forward. So I don't know what to say to you," they said. I've continued to do this. I've worked with law enforcement people on my task force. Thank God they're there, because they're the ones who are really watching out and where it's happening in the cities. We're all learning together. No one profession is at fault. It has to be a combined, concerted effort for us to try to do something about this. But that fact that people get suspensions, well, first of all, I have to say that I'm not a lawyer, not a civil lawyer. I am a church lawyer, but that's different in the Catholic Church. We have to say, and we hear from judges and attorneys, that these are some of the most difficult cases to prosecute, because there are lots of different qualifications and areas that they have to consider, even under the title of force or fraud or coercion. And one trafficked person said to me, "I just about made it into the definition, but I had one document missing." So, these cases are on many different levels on the continuum of a completed prosecution. But, I also want to say this. There's good news coming out of this, too. In 2011, the analysis that was done by the National Human Trafficking Resource Center said that 26 states had got a grade of F concerning their legislation that's on the books about human trafficking. 26 states, half of them, but by last year, none of them got a grade of F. And there are organizations that do grading of every state in the union about, if you get a grade of A, or if you're in Tier 1, you have maximum kind of legislation to help people. Wisconsin, by the way, is in Tier 2, and I think has gotten a grade of B. So we're moving, and there is legislation in the docket and on the way that is continuing to receive conversation in our state system. What does it look like? Isn't this shocking? Those red blotches on the map say where the density of trafficked victims occur. And we can say, yes, it's on the East Coast, but look, or east of the Mississippi would be probably the best way to describe this. Florida and California and Texas. I'm not sure this map is the best one yet, but it's the latest one that I could find. They tell me that the biggest concentration of human trafficking is in Texas and Florida. No, Texas and California. And I do know that California is a big spot because I work with a network of Catholic sisters that I know in California that are just so overworked in the area of trying to help victims. Take a look at the traffic flows in the United States. Basically, they follow the interstate system. And that would be true all over the United States, not just in Wisconsin, but Wisconsin has its own traffic flow too. If we look at it, you would see that the traffic flow comes up through Chicago, through Milwaukee, Madison, Green Bay, and on to Minnesota and further west. So we're right on the interstate. You're a little further away than what La Crosse is, but we're very aware of this possibility in our local region. Here's another way of taking that same U.S. map and looking at it in Wisconsin. And as I've just described the traffic flows, you can see what's happening here. In 2013, Wisconsin did its first baseline study of human trafficking incidences, and at that time found that half of our counties responded that there were trafficking victims there. Today, they say all of our counties have reported human trafficking cases. The number of calls is over 700, and the number of cases is about 162 in 2015. That's the latest data I have. And just because there are a lot of calls doesn't mean they're a case. But it's great that there are calls because it means that people are alive and are out watching. And I love today's scripture about we all need to have our blindness cured. And I tell everybody that my eyesight has improved in the last 4 or 5 years rather than gotten worse because I've learned more what to look for. And you also need to know now that Wisconsin has an anti-human trafficking task force, which has been in functioning since about December of 2015, and it's doing great work. One of the things that is planned is that they plan to divide the state into regional hub systems where we can focus on the issue in a particular area, get it under a functioning level, and then move into another section of the state and another and another and another. I think there will be 7, does that sound right? 7 regional hubs. And there will be requirements for agencies to qualify as an agency that can respond to victims. And so all of that training is forthcoming in the coming months. I'm encouraged by it. Okay, you might want to look to the right of this slide, where in 2016 only there were over 300 calls, 63 cases reported, half of them are sex exploitation. And that fits kind of a national, global experience of slavery in the world. So our statistics are not so different from everybody else. And the task force, the state of Wisconsin, has developed a poster that you will see in different places. I know they have placed them in all the rest stops in the state of Wisconsin, alerting people to do what they can to stop human trafficking. And the important thing down there is that number at the bottom of the page, 1-888-3737-888, is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And I always say, you don't need to write it down. You don't even have to put it into your phone. Just remember, 888 on either end, 3737 in the middle. So that if you see something, go to your phone immediately, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They will immediately get in touch with the area from where the call came from and start a process of investigation with local law enforcement. Wisconsin, as far as I can tell from the data, is about midway in the 50 states for incidents of human trafficking, about 27th. Now, lacrosse. We decided when our task force started, almost 4 years ago now, we just started a possibility of trying to create awareness around human trafficking in our own area. That's our mission. We do not run safe houses because we're not equipped yet to do that, and I don't know if we ever will, because safe houses are available in Milwaukee and Madison, and the state just set up and opened a new one in Clark County, and I think there is one in Wausau, possibly one in Eau Claire. And it's important to have a lot of safe houses because sometimes the victims need to be moved from place to place for their own security and safety. But in lacrosse, we said, people were saying doesn't happen. So we wanted to investigate with our own agencies, do we have the capacity to respond if we do find a victim? What can we do about prevention? Are the people in our agencies trained for it? What are their greatest needs? And have you ever encountered a victim? And we found out of the 45, we contacted 87 agencies. And out of the 39 that responded, 45% response, pretty good, we think, 18 agencies reported having encountered human trafficking victims. So now we're at the point where we're self-reporting in our agencies, and that's good. That's good. Have they solved all the issues? But they at least can recognize the signs of a victim. And, when we say it doesn't happen here, yesterday in the La Crosse Tribune, this was reported. La Crosse County man accused of assaulting a 9-year-old girl. More charges are possible in Illinois. And basically the text, if you can't read it there, he required oral sex from a 9-year-old girl in exchange for gummy bears. That's a typical story. Typical. When there is something exchanged for sex, and they're forced into sex, if they get them something nice that they really want, and that little 9-year-old girl, that's all she wanted, was gummy bears. Here we are. So I always like to take the latest news and put it there, and I believe this man it is said he was found in Coon Valley. How many miles from here? 8? Okay. So what should you do? Well, the first thing I would do is call 911 because that's what we're most ready to do. We all know about 911 numbers. But then call also the National Human Trafficking Resource line, the 888-3737-888 number, and we can connect people. Those agencies can connect one another. So be on the lookout and do that. I just have a couple more slides. There's the 188 number. Again, you can also text it. You can also submit information online if you want to. So I'm getting now to the point about what can you do, what can we do, what can I do? And the very first thing is to keep your eyes open. Watch around you. Sometimes I have felt like I've become more and more paranoid because I remember incidences when I was encountering a human trafficking victim maybe 10 years ago, didn't have a clue because I didn't know how to recognize the signs. I thought it was something else. And now I'm much more awake with my eyes. Get educated. That's what you're doing now. This is education. Get involved in some way and then leverage your resources. You can participate by working with agencies that are doing something about it. Again, what can you do personally? I always start with refuse pornography, refuse commercial sex. Just don't do it. In this day and age, I know that might sound like a pious platitude. But what if people really refused that? Avoid buying goods and services from industries that rely on forced labor. How do I know? Well, you can go to freetowork.org and it'll give you quite a lot of information. You can ask your local businesses where their supplies come from, where their food comes from that they bring into your town. Are those agencies and businesses in any way connected with other organizations that employ slave labor? You can go and just Google human trafficking and read the state report, the Department of Labor's report on goods that are produced by child labor. Here's the easiest thing you can do. Tell someone what you learned today. Tell one person. Start a conversation. If you really want to be zealous, tell 5 or 10. And don't stop the conversation. Ask hotels if their employees have been trained to watch out for the signs of human trafficking. You know, the big hotels and airlines in our country are doing a great job, a very, very good job. Marriott, Hilton, Radisson, I know for sure, have joined ECPAT, which is the organization where they pledge to train their employees to watch for signs of human trafficking. I know that American Airlines and Delta are also doing a very good job. They're just requiring that happens in their industries so that together we as a society and in the world can work on this issue together. Ask your grocers, I've mentioned that, or other businesses where they get their goods from. That they might say, I don't have a clue if forced labor is involved in it. Well, what that does is encourage them to go and find out who they're buying from. It doesn't mean, we're going to just finger point all the time and be mean about it. But what we're trying to do is encourage good thinking and a little more investigation into who we are relating to in our businesses. There was a bill on the federal legislation about requiring businesses that earn more than $100 million a year to report where their supply chain comes from. It hasn't been passed yet. We've been working on it for a long time, and it's going to take some time. People say, oh, more paperwork. Yeah, but more intelligence too, I think, in how we do our work. Contributing to, so that's the way we work for legislative change. Contributing to scholarships for human trafficking survivors. I just want to point out that most survivors who need education are probably high school students. If they get brought into the life at the age of 12 to 14, they haven't finished high school yet. Our mind goes to college scholarships, but the first thing is basic education at the high school level, and then colleges who are also working to give scholarships to survivors so that they can learn another avenue for employment that will pay them and make them feel like respected employees and workers in the workplace. This is just a little graphic of our lacrosse task force. We try to work on all of these things, training and advocacy and legislative work, collecting data. The study I told you about just in the lacrosse area with agencies was one piece of data that we have put together, but we've also had Viterbo University in its graduate department of psychology has done 2 studies related to human trafficking. So, I'll do anything to get someone involved with finding out a little more information that's related to human trafficking. And it's working. It's been very, very good. One of the strategies we had also, I'll just skip past that one, is a billboard campaign a couple of years ago. We had 5 billboards. That's what we could afford around the area of La Crosse, and we left them up for 4 months. I know that the sisters, the Catholic sisters in Wisconsin, have been doing this around the whole state. Also, you might have seen some in different larger cities of the state. So that's what we have been doing, and where there's a lot of networking that's happening. So at this point, that's going to be the end of what I'm going to tell you. I'm wondering if I can turn to John here and just have him respond to that a little bit, or even, is he able, what are you able to tell us about your experience of perhaps meeting a trafficked victim?
Okay.
In this area, hometown Westby.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sister Marlene. That was very informative. I have no experience with it personally as a law enforcement officer here with the Sheriff's Office. As some of you know, I've been here in Vernon County my whole life, 34 years serving Vernon County in law enforcement, now as your sheriff. But we have worked directly with agencies that have. Our fear locally is some of the vulnerable people that we may have, especially runaways. You saw the statistics. That's our biggest fear when we have a runaway in Vernon County, and we're involved with that, is trying to locate that young person as quickly as possible and follow up on those leads. And in our area, a lot of times those runaways do end up in La Crosse, Madison. We've had some, all over the United States. And that's our fear, that they're going to become a victim of these predators. And the people that prey on these young people and on adults and everybody else, that's the best word for them. They're predators. As you heard, they prey on their vulnerabilities, and they are always aware of what's going on and looking for that person or that individual that they can basically get a hold of and get them into something such as forced labor or forced sex. The sex trafficking is a horrendous situation for these young people especially. You saw the slides up there. A lot of these individuals are from other countries, and the sex trade makes up about 4% of the total human trafficking issue, but it nets about 40 or 45% of the profits worldwide. And when you see some of these other countries, we don't think of it about here in the United States, but yet the most vulnerable are young women, especially young women from the United States. And they pay more. These Johns, or these people that want to get these individuals, they'll pay much more for a young girl from the United States because of, one, their hygiene. They're better educated. Their skin, their hair, their dentistry is better and healthier than a lot of other countries. And so they're prime for money. And that's the big driving factor. And again, supply and demand is the big push on a lot of that. Our goal here is to make sure that we're educated. Today it's education, information, and awareness. And, you'll leave here with that today, but continue that. Because as Sister Marlene said, when you approach the judges, we don't have a problem here. They didn't have the education or the awareness or the information to realize what it is. In Vernon County, I can say, do we have a problem? We don't know. We do have situations that we've been on the fringes of. We've had situations where people have left and came back. As far as anybody being trafficked or picked up or taken by force from Vernon County, it probably has happened. We just don't know about it. Our goal is to educate our law enforcement officers and the public as well as to what to look for. We call them red flags. And there's a lot of different things you can be aware of. I always say, when I look out at the group here today, trust your life experiences. You deal with people. We all know right from wrong. We all have met people in our lives that all of a sudden we get into a situation and it makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up, or you leave there and you talk to a loved one or someone else and you say, something just wasn't right about this. That's a red flag. Now it may be something that you can think about and say, could that have been a situation? When our officers go up to a door on a domestic abuse situation, we're looking for body language. It's not always what people say, it's what we see. It's what we don't hear that sometimes speaks volumes or gives us the most information. If you get a victim that doesn't make eye contact with you, but they tell you everything is fine, there's a red flag. Oftentimes, these victims of human trafficking, whether it's the sex trade or whether it's forced labor, they won't talk about it, especially to me or to law enforcement, because some of the areas where they come from, they can't trust law enforcement because law enforcement is so corrupt. They have a distrust automatically of authority, so they do not feel comfortable talking to the police. If they're from other countries, they may not know where to turn. Imagine if we were abducted and taken to another country and forced into a labor camp or a sex trade or another thing, or serving in someone's house or working for a factory and forced to stay there, and they took our papers and basically stripped us of our identity. Where would we turn to? Where would we go for help? Imagine being 13, 14 years old and thrust into that type of a life. They don't know where to go to. Oftentimes in the United States, what we see, a church. They get a chance to get away. They go to the only safe place they may realize that they can actually trust and feel comfortable talking to someone, and it might be a local church or something in their area. So being aware of it is very, very important. The stories on these things are horrific. One story that I remember listening to, a young lady, they called her Jennifer. She was a typical situation where she had gotten upset with her mother on her 16th birthday. She wanted a sweet 16 birthday party. Her mom couldn't afford it, couldn't do it. So what was her reaction? She ran away. She left. And that was from the Midwest, not too far from here, in a larger city. She went and found a girlfriend of hers from school, and she talked with her, and she said, well, come with me. My boyfriend, he'll take care of you. She was becoming a victim of a predator who was a classmate of hers. Took her to an apartment house in the city where they lived, introduced her to the boyfriend, who was a young adult, and this young girl basically told her story. Once they found out that she had not told anyone where she was going or what she did, that she just basically left the home, that was it. She was taken to a room in that apartment complex where she was beaten and she was raped the very first night. She was chained to a bed. All she had was a mattress on the floor and a coffee can as a bathroom, and she spent the next almost 3 years of her life in that room and in that building as a sex slave. Every day it was the same thing over and over again in her life. She couldn't leave. She was forced into the sex trade, and she was abused. She was beaten down. She lost her identity. She had nowhere to turn to. She knew there was other girls in this complex because she would hear them talk about the different doors and rooms, and she'd hear the different noises. And finally, she heard her captor say that he was looking for white girls for the street. She thought, that's my opportunity to get away. So she started gaining his trust, and it took her 6 more months to gain the trust of her captor, enough that did just what Sister Marlene said, bought her clothes, fixed her all up, got her looking good so she could work the streets for him. Her first night out on the street, when he dropped her off at an intersection or on a corner, when he went one way, as soon as he was out of sight, she ran the other direction and sought help and was able to find someone to help her. She was later returned home, and he was later caught and arrested and convicted. But this was a young girl that lost years of her life, and she put trust into a girlfriend. So these things do happen. We had a situation with awareness of a gentleman that went to one of the trainings, and he went to a conference. While he was at the conference, that morning he did like a lot of us do, got up early, went down for breakfast at the restaurant, and he noticed a very good-looking young lady, long dark hair. She was very polite. She waited on him for breakfast, doing her job for this restaurant chain, which was a fairly large restaurant chain and motel chain. And he got done with breakfast and went about his day. Went through the conference. Later that day, they had a lunch served at the same motel. He saw the same young lady working, doing her job. Later that evening, they had a banquet. They had a couple guest speakers, and then they had an open bar. And while they're all sitting around after the whole thing was done, he was sitting there with his buddies and with other co-workers, and they're talking. And he noticed that at 11:30 midnight that night, the same young girl was cleaning and picking up and working. And he finally asked her, he said, "Why are you still here?" He says, "How many hours do you work in a day?" She was very hesitant to answer, but she was very polite, and she just basically brushed it off, but it bothered him. He remembered being educated and having information and awareness on trafficking, human trafficking, he later, it was a few days later, he reported it. They investigated it and found out that this motel chain had dozens and dozens of young boys and girls working in that chain and working at that particular motel who were working sometimes 20 hours a day for little or no pay. Their boss, their captors, basically, the predators, were promising them one thing. They had came to this country or were sent to this country with their parents, some of them and most of them on legal visas, for a better life. And that's the hardest part about these situations, because these predators prey on their dreams. They'll tell them they love them, they'll tell them all these things and get them hooked into these different trades, or they'll promise them an education, promise them a better future, and it turns out to be nothing but a nightmare for these individuals. So I would do the same thing as now I'm doing the same thing, Sister Marlene, and educate yourselves and tell people about it, but be aware. If you see anything that looks out of the ordinary or that bothers you, let someone know. Call law enforcement. Get a hold of the sheriff's office or your local police departments. There's you can go on the internet and get a lot of different numbers, and that's very important to report it, to get someone looking at it. We need to educate more people and do better. We need better legislation in our country on this. We don't want our country to be some country that ends up being in the top numbers with some of these situations. But we are vulnerable to it, and we have to do better as a society to educate and make sure that we do everything we can, especially to protect our young people, because they're the most vulnerable. You've heard me talk many times here in Vernon County. We have an increasing number of methamphetamine cases and heroin cases, and it's getting younger and younger and younger. And those people are going to be more vulnerable as this continues. So we have to, again, do everything we can, because a lot of these are interconnected. We see young people, if that's their thing and they're addicted to these drugs, that's a very vulnerable spot to be in. Because if I'm in human trafficking, you can bet I'm going to get myself some methamphetamine or heroin to give them, because now that's how I'll hook them into that. And many of these do end up being drugged, especially in the sex trade. And it's horrendous, because some of these young girls, with the statistics, they will be forced to have sexual relations 15 to 20 times a day. But it's money driven. And the younger they are, the more money these predators are making. Some of these young girls are generating $1,000 a day and $2,000 a day on weekends for their captors. So it's money driven. So with that, unless somebody has any questions, I'll turn it back over to Sister Marlene. And thank you for coming here today, and thank you folks for sticking around.